Welcome to everyone. This is a pleasure for me to introduce a dear friend who also happens to be, I think, the nation's premier expert on prison masculinity. Not something that you would ordinarily say. I think when I'm, when I finish my career as a therapist, I'm just going to work on prison masculinities. But Terry is really quite amazing and has had a wonderful, wonderful career. He's trained as a psychiatrist, and for those of us who are sociologists, I would say he's like a social psychiatrist, in the sense that he doesn't simply see social problems in psychiatric terms to be dealt with medically, or even through a kind of individual therapy, but rather as social problems. I guess that's the fair thing to say. And so he's been very involved in questions about prison masculinity for some time. He edited a book with Don Sabo and Willie London, who was at the time incarcerated at Attica, wasn't he?
That's right.
So one of his co-editors was, in fact, an African-American man who was incarcerated. And he's always been interested in not simply the what brings men into prison, but what happens to them in prison. And that's kind of what he's going to talk about today. What actually happens to men when they go to prison. So prison as the cause of problems as opposed to the solution to problems. I won't say any more. I'm going to leave the floor to Terry, but I'm really, really grateful that you were able to come and be with us on your little whirlwind New York book tour. Oh, and I'll let you all know he recorded Leonard Lopate, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's like the book show on NPR here in New York. The only book show where the host actually reads the books. So it was recorded yesterday, but I'll let you know when when it'll air. So we'll put that out.
Thank you, Michael. Michael and I met in the 80s, I guess, in the pro-feminist men's movement. And Michael was a real leader and sort of did the academic wing of our men's work. And the pro-feminist men's movement was a reaction to feminism, the second wave women's movement. And it was all about what's our part in all this? How would we, if we're against sexism and against homophobia and against racism, what are we supposed to do? And we had to invent that. And I think we're at another moment like that where we need to invent it again. Let me start. I'm a psychiatrist, as Michael said. I'm very interested in social issues. In the Wright Institute, where I teach, we have a notion of clinician to society. And that is that we're usually treating individuals or groups. But really, the problems of the individuals and the groups are social. And we need to keep an eye on what's going on socially and do something to affect the social underpinnings of the personal and group problems. And that's called clinician to society. It's a concept of Nevitt Sanford, who was a social psychologist back in the 50s and 60s. And he started at the Wright Institute. I have a few underlying premises, which I will lay out quickly, but they underlie all of my work as a forensic psychiatrist. Besides practicing psychiatry, I testify in court, usually about jail and prison related, either something about conditions of confinement, which are cruel and unusual and therefore unconstitutional, or about mental health care. There's a huge proportion of prisoners with serious mental illness, or about sexual abuse, which is one of the places where I bring in gender studies quite a lot. First principle that underlies my work is that prison is not a place apart. We like to think about lock them up and throw away the key. They're going somewhere, it's out there somewhere, we're never going to visit it, we don't know what's going on in it. And when the society does that, what tends to happen is the problems of the society get disappeared into the prison, and awful abuses happen. Dostoevsky said this, that if you want to know about a society, go into its prisons. Second, racism. Our criminal justice system is all about racism. I recommend strongly Michelle Alexander's book where she summed it up, The New Jim Crow. But The criminal justice system has an incredible history of racism, and it continues right into the prisons. So that African American, particularly young males, are much, much more frequently arrested. When they get arrested, they're more likely than their white counterparts to go to jail. Whereas the white kid is going to be sent home and sent into therapy, the black kid is going to go into jail. Then they're going to be tried, they're going to have inadequate representation. On average, they're going to get longer sentences by far than white counterparts who are doing the same crime. Then when they get to prison, the same thing continues. So that in prison, the discipline system is going to mirror the criminal justice system at large. So that in my work, which is largely lately about solitary confinement, and I'll talk some about that, a huge proportion of people in solitary confinement are African American. In New York, it's 59%. Two things about this. One is that the more secretive an institution or facility is, the more abuse occurs there. That public notice is one of the best counters to abuse. And when the public doesn't notice of an institution, this was true of the mental asylums back in the 40s and 50s, and it's true in the jails and prisons today. Without public notice and without someone caring about what goes on, it tends to happen, and human beings are like this. It was proven in the Stanford mock prison experiment in the early 70s, that when one group has massive control over another group, and the group that's under their control has no recourse, in law we call that due process, and the entire drama happens in secret, then terrible abuse happens. And in the Stanford mock prison experiment, it was a 2-week experiment that had to be stopped in a few days because the students who were the subjects were either acting as a guard or acting as an inmate in prison. And the guards became so abusive towards the students, their peers, who were playing prisoners, that they had to stop the experiment. That happens behind bars, and that's why I'm on a campaign. My book is called Solitary: The Inside Story of Supermax Isolation and How We Can Abolish It, published by University of California Press last month, and I'm on a tour right now about that book. The other thing that happens when we don't count the prisons as part of our society but treat them as a place somewhere else is that we miss the main dynamic that's going on in criminal justice. And what I describe this as disappearing. Our society has had a history. We more or less take care of disadvantaged people. In some periods of history, we're very interested in taking care of them, like the New Deal or the war on poverty. It's a period of history where the society is generous and public programs are set up, for instance, a social service safety net. At other periods, those programs are taken away. And it has to do with a cultural milieu in which there's less generosity and less caring. From the 70s until now, we've entered a period like that. If you look at community mental health as an example, which happens to be my field, in '63, President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Centers Act, which funded public clinics in the community to take care of the most seriously disturbed people who happen to be the lowest income people. And so we had public mental health services. Over the years since then, if you watch the kind of services that are available in the budgeting, that system has been dismantled. So there's been an incremental shrinking of the public mental health budget. Meanwhile, interestingly enough, the prison population has expanded probably 10 times by today since the early 70s. The official report is 7 times, but I think it's closer to 10. But geometrically, it's been expanded. The proportion of people in the prisons with serious mental illness has increased all the while. So with geometric expansion of the population, we also have an increase in the proportion with serious mental illness. If you look at the budget of mental health care in corrections. Everybody thinks, well, they're going to jail or prison, they'll get treatment there. The budget has not expanded relatively. I mean, it's a little, with inflation and such, there's a little more money, but we're talking about many times over the number of people with serious mental illness behind bars. They're not getting mental health care, adequate mental health care, in the correctional system. Now, I call that a disappearing. Here's my interpretation. We as a society do not have the will to take care of the disadvantaged among us. We can't stand to see them in our presence suffering. For instance, homeless people, where there's a large proportion of people with mental illness. So we have what Jürgen Habermas calls a legitimation crisis. That is, we think we live in a democracy. We have some vague notion that democracy, besides being about voting, is also in some degree about equity, and that the gap between the rich and the poor in our society is actually a contradiction to some of our notion of democracy, and we're ambiguous about that. We don't have a clear idea about how much democracy depends on equity. But we can't stand to see people suffering in front of our eyes, so we lock them up. And here comes the saying, lock them up and throw away the key. We disappear people into prison who we as a society do not have the will to care for. So that's what I think is going on with the way, what's secret in prison and how there's so little attention to what's going on. Michael and other academic gender studies folks have evolved a term called hegemonic masculinity. That is, we have all kinds of masculine notions of masculinity among us, but there's a generally pervasive notion that sort of takes control, and it's sort of the prototype. I won't get into this in great detail, but it's sort of the notions we have in common about masculinity. For instance, I think we'd all agree that compared to women, men have few friends and tend to keep their cards close to their chest. And the men's movement of the 80s challenged that and said, actually, that's not real healthy. That men who keep their cards close to their chests and have few friends are not living as good quality of life as they might be. But that's something we think about as sort of being part of masculinity. That's the hegemonic masculinity. Now in prison, I call this toxic masculinity. That is, the same things, the same characteristics that we were described to have hegemonic masculinity on the outside, in prison become magnified and exaggerated. So I think what we have in prison is toxic masculinity, which I define this way. The constellation of socially regressive male traits that serve to foster domination, the devaluation of women, homophobia, and wanton violence. That's toxic masculinity as practiced or as obvious in our prisons and jails. This notion is being contested today, and I love to see it. You know, I think we're in a very dark period with Trump and the whole federal administration. They're just taking apart all of the positive things our government stands for. But I attribute to Trump a gift, which is organizing the left. I have never been to meetings since the 60s that are as crowded as Our Revolution, Indivisible, Stand Up for Social Justice, community meetings that usually would involve 3 or 4 people are now in 30 or 40 people. They have to find new chairs to bring in because everybody wants to do something about the awful things going on. Well, there's another contradiction to look at, and that is we've elected a president who admitted to groping and is proud of his homophobia and his racism, overt racism, xenophobia, his anti-immigrant. He just is proud of it. He's totally non-conscious about how awful what it is he stands for is. Meanwhile, with that kind of a shadow over us, we have a Me Too phenomenon. I mean, in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein revelations, we have women all over the place stepping forward and saying, that happened to me too, And then we have a whole lot of strong people, including our women senators, saying, well, this is not okay, and that we have to do something else about our culture rather than making it a given that men grope women like our president does. So we have a new level of culture war. And I think a big question, and I hope this is a question, I know it is in the Center for Study of Men and Masculinity, is what are the men going to do about this? You know, and I'm going to give some parallels. One of the things that I think happens in prison is that prison is a mirror of our social relations. I testify in cases about the sexual abuse of women. In men's prisons, sexual abuse is usually prisoner on prisoner. And there are fights, there are rapes, etc., sex slaves. In women's prisons, it's staff abusing women, typically, not always, but typically male staff with female prisoners. And there's a blue code. The blue code is that staff in a prison, the officers in particular, do not snitch on each other. They will not talk about what happened. We have that in the Black Lives Matter situation out in the community. Police will not testify against police who shoot somebody for no reason at all. They just won't, they didn't see anything, they don't know anything, and they're not going to testify. In prison, I usually, when I investigate a case of sexual abuse. In Michigan, we had a very big case, the Neal case, where there were 500 women who claimed to have been sexually abused by staff. They won $100 million in a settlement about 5 years ago. One of the women took the stand in court, and it's incredible to see these women who are just abused right and left. They were abused before they came in, they were abused as children, they were abused in prison. Take the stand and describe what happened. She's in prison, and a male officer leads her into an area of the prison that prisoners are not allowed to be in. They pass a sergeant sitting at a desk at the line between the prisoners area and the staff area where prisoners are not supposed to be. And the officer who's leading her there, and she doesn't know why he's leading her there, stops and chats with the sergeant while she's standing there. Then he proceeds to take her down a hall, into a closet, and rape her viciously. Leaves her there. She puts herself together as best she can and starts walking back down the hall. And the sergeant sitting at the desk, hey, what are you doing here? Prisoners aren't allowed in this area. That sergeant didn't report what happened. The sergeant didn't testify when there was a civil action that I was an expert for. So that's the blue code. Mm-hmm. All right, now I'm saying that one of my premises is what goes on in prison is a mirror of what goes on out here. The issue of what men want to do about the pervasiveness of sexual harassment in the workplace, in government, in schools, is a big question in front of us. So there's a parallel, for instance, of how I think the prison is a mirror of what's going on in society. Race is another example. I mentioned that 59% of people in solitary confinement in New York are African American. There's only 13 or 16%, I think New York has 16%, California and other big states have 13% African Americans. So how do 59% of the solitary confinement population get to be African American? I think we need to look at that. We need to do a micro-analysis of that. In prison, the toxic masculinity I've talked about is this. You have to be tough to survive in prison. There's a male code. The male code, by the way, is exactly the same as the officer's code. You have to buff up. And the reason you're buffing up is that you have to look like if someone attacks you, they're going to get hurt. You don't have to hurt anybody, although if someone challenges you to fight, you have to fight and you have to do what the prisoners say, make a showing. That is, you have to at least fight well enough so the other guy is hurt and people aren't just going to pick on you and rape you. So that's part of being competent in prison, in that culture. I don't know if any of you saw The Night Of, a miniseries on television. There's a character there, what is his name? Roz, I think, is the character. And he goes into prison as a slight young man, kind of timid, and he gets in a lot of trouble, and he gets persecuted. And he starts allying with sort of a thug who runs, this is a section of Rikers Island here. And he gets allied with him, the guy gives him protection, he starts buffing up, he starts doing jobs for his friend. He starts becoming a prison tough. And the whole series is about how he was transformed into a prison tough. Well, that's average. That's what happens to everybody. That's what happens to you in prison. And that creates a drama on the prison yard. It reminds me of junior high school. I had a gym teacher in junior high school who was military. And he would scream at us, and he would call us sissies. And if you cried, or if, for instance, you didn't do well in a physical effort, whatever we were playing, he would say, you're just like a girl. I don't want any girls in my class. And this would be early teenage boys. And that's what he would say. So in prison, that kind of a schoolyard drama is the norm. That's how it is. You go out in the yard, you have to fight, you have to make a showing. If you don't, you're probably going to get raped. And, rape in prison, but I think out in the community too, is not about sex at all. It's about dominance. The dominance hierarchy in prison is such that the stronger male owns the weaker male and therefore can use him as a sex slave. And that's the norm in prison. I have developed a model for men in men's prisons. It's a little bit more dramatic, and I make it dramatic in order to make the point, but it fits. And I've shared this and discussed it with many prisoners and ex-prisoners, and they agree with this formulation. And it's this. There's an exaggerated dominance hierarchy. It's very, very important where you sit on the dominance hierarchy. The reason you've buffed up, the reason you don't show your weakness, the reason you don't cry, as my junior high gym teacher would say, is to show that you're tough, and that in the dominance hierarchy, you're in the top group. You're the dominator, you're not dominated. So there's exaggerated hierarchy with the tough guys on top and weaker guys on the bottom. That's the first point. This is a 4-point model. Second point, there's a sharp demarcation between the top and the bottom. You're one or the other. There's nothing else. You're either tough enough to take care of yourself out on the yard, and when a fight happens, everybody's going to watch. No one's going to break it up. If you get into a fight, if someone challenges you, you're going to have to fight it out, because the prisoners are going to surround you and watch who does what, and they're going to measure people about how they do in these fights. So there's a top and a bottom and nothing in between. That's the second point, the sharp demarcation. Third, the bottom is defined as effeminate. So if you listen to the names prisoners call each other or watch the ugly phenomena of prison rape, as people are moved down the hierarchy, as they're beaten up or as they're taken advantage of, as someone steals your stuff, you have to do something bold in response. Otherwise, you're going to be a perpetual victim. But your victimhood is going to be called feminine. You are going to be called a weakling, a sissy, a punk, which has several meanings in prison. It's an ambiguous term. One term is that you're a weakling. The other is that you've been sexually victimized. And both terms are in use. And then you get called other names, faggot, and the last is girl. You're called a girl. And if you're ensconced in the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, you're probably going to be someone's sex slave. And we don't know how much of that happens. And the reason is because a lot of people voluntarily become the sexual partner of somebody who's tougher than them. That person offers them protection. And then when researchers come around and say, have you ever been sexually abused? They'll say no, because they don't feel that they're sexually abused. However, they're coerced into sex in order to save their life. So they don't get counted when people go around counting sexual abuse. So that's the third point in this model. And the fourth is there's a drastic narrowing of personal possibilities. You have to be one or the other. There are exceptions. Jailhouse lawyers, for instance, are an exception. I've talked to a bunch of guys who don't want to fight it out to see who's top dog. And what they will do is go into the law library and they'll learn the law. They'll teach themselves. Then they'll write briefs for people, like when they're appealing their conviction or something like that. Then they become valuable and nobody's going to mess with them. Or they'll write a brief for a tough guy, and the tough guy will protect them, not for sex, but because they're invaluable as a law clerk. There are other ways you can do that. There are secrets to it, and people find alternatives. But in general, personal possibilities are restricted extremely. So the tough guy has to act tough, and he has to buff up, and he has to be willing to fight. Fights aren't occurring all the time. Fights are, you walk onto a prison yard, and from what you've seen in movies or imagined or something, you think everybody's beating up and raping everybody. Nothing like it. They're always only potential, and they happen one time or another. They happen to everybody at least once. So the prisoners are sort of testing the mettle of new people, for instance. And they're not pervasive. They're not happening all the time. What's happening is the threat of violence and rape is keeping people in their place. So the prison tough, and that who for the moment I'm worried about, the prison tough has to be tough, has to buff up, has to have a mean stare, has to keep his cards close to his chest, has to not admit weakness, has to not depend on other people. Well, what are these things? These are hegemonic masculinity. So what I'm saying is that in prison, hegemonic masculinity, which we have out here, is magnified. And this 4-point model then describes what happens to people in prison. And their human possibilities are restricted on account of that. I'm going to mention a case study. I was recently asked to testify. In criminal trials these days, there are two phases. One is called the guilt phase, and one is called the sentencing phase. In the guilt phase, they decide whether a person's guilty, not guilty by reason of insanity, whatever. Then after it's determined that they've been convicted, or they're guilty, or maybe they confessed and now they're guilty, there's a sentencing phase, and where the judge or the jury, depending on the arrangement, decides what the punishment is going to be. I sometimes am asked, sometimes I testify in the first part, the guilt phase, because, for instance, not guilty by reason of insanity, I have to testify, well, this person fits the definition of insanity, therefore you shouldn't find them guilty. But then after they're found guilty, and this is more frequent, I get asked to testify in the sentencing phase. Now, in sentencing, we have what's called mitigation and aggravation. Mitigation is reasons we shouldn't give this person a harsh punishment, reasons why we should understand their human dilemma and that they've done whatever crime they've done. And aggravation is things like gang membership, previous crimes, viciousness, that make it more rational to give them a harsh sentence. So I testify. All right, Dennis Levis is a guy in Arizona. He's in the prisons. He's been in the prisons for life. He is, the time I met him, he's around 30. He might be 31 or 32. He entered prison at 16. He was not a tough. He's 5'6" and slim. He's 16. He borrowed a friend's gun and robbed a drug dealer on his block. First of all, the stupidity of the crime is just amazing. But second of all, he's not a vicious criminal, and he didn't use the gun, and actually, he took the money that he took and gave it back to the drug dealer the next day because he felt sorry for him. And they arrested him, they found him guilty, and they gave him, 15 to life or something like that for this armed robbery. In prison, he's scared to death. He's 16, he's got peach fuzz on his cheeks, he's small, he can't fight, he's not a street kid, he doesn't know how to fight, and he's going to get raped. In the country right now, we're dismantling the juvenile justice system. This is another one of those invisible things. And the way we're dismantling it is by trying juveniles as adults. In New York, until last year, it was 16-year-olds. All 16 and over are tried as adults in New York. I think your legislature just moved that up to 17. Still, they're kids. And they get tried as adult, they go to an adult prison. Rikers Island is full of teenagers. That's who's been having trouble at Rikers Island. So these kids go to the adult prisons, well, they're prey. If you have peach fuzz on your cheeks, I hope this is all right to say, you have to either fight or fuck. And they press you. So the minute you walk onto the prison yard, people are saying, hey honey, or something like nice ass, come bunk with me, I'll show you a good time. And this goes on all over the place. Teenagers are separated from the general population until they're 18. But because he was terrified and afraid of being raped, Dennis made himself a shank, which is a prison-made knife, so he could defend himself because he was going to get called out to fight. So they caught him with the shank. They threw him in solitary confinement. Now he's in solitary confinement, he's 16, and he sits there until he's 19. So he's got 3 years of solitary confinement when he should be going to school, learning how to be an adult, dating, having social experience. He's in solitary confinement. He gets out of solitary confinement, he's scared to death. He's had no prison experience, he doesn't know how to fight, he's still a little guy. And so he decides to make friends with gangbangers. In prison, white gangs are the Aryan Brotherhood and a few others. So in Arizona prisons, there's also some other white power groups that are not Aryan Brotherhood. They're called street gangs. They're not actually prison gangs, but they have status with the Aryan Brotherhood, and they'll protect you. So he starts to become friendly with them. He gets tattoos, white power, on his chest. And so I'm sitting with him, and I said, well, you know, I'm Jewish, and I'm just wondering what your Aryan philosophy, whether it's okay for me to be helping you. He says, I have nothing against Jews. I am not a Nazi. I don't believe all that stuff. I believe white people should stand up for themselves, and in prison you have to, because when stuff happens, you have to hang out with the white people because you're going to get attacked by either Latinos or blacks, and you're in a fight, you have to be on one side or another. So he gets closer and closer to these people. He has a cellmate. They're forced to have cellmates, and this is several years after coming in to the adult prison system. And his cellmate is what's called an Aryan Brotherhood affiliate. That is someone who's close to the Aryan Brotherhood and wants to be a member of the gang. The gang is very small. They only have a few trusted members in the gang. So he wants to be a member, so he's considered by the prison system an affiliate, but they don't lock him up in solitary. And that's his cellmate. This guy happens to be a very good guy. Dennis likes him because he's not a bully. He doesn't victimize any. He's a big tough guy, but he doesn't victimize anybody. This guy gets an assignment. In order to join the Aryan Brotherhood, you have to get wet. Get wet basically means you have to kill someone. And you have to draw blood. That's what the get wet means. And so this guy gets an assignment to go kill somebody who either snitched or the gang's mad at him for something, we don't know. But this is Dennis's cellmate. So Dennis and him go into another area of the prison where they shouldn't be. They snuck in. When the gates are opening and closed, they squeeze through the gates. They go to this guy's area, and his cellmate says, keep watch, I have some business. And Dennis thinks, oh, he's going to collect a bet or something like that. The guy goes in and kills another prisoner. And with the screaming and hollering and all, Dennis runs in, and there's this guy killing somebody. And the guy he's killing is fighting back, so Dennis jumps on him and helps with the killing. All right. Now he's being tried for murder. He's been in prison his whole adult life. He's being tried for murder. That's where I step in. I'm being asked by the public defender to come and speak to mitigation. So here's my mitigation. Massively abused as a child. He was ignored by his mother, who was a drug addict. His father raped his sister. He just ran the streets. He had absolutely no direction. Dropped out of school. In school, the teachers loved him. He was very bright. We have teachers testifying that he's a very bright kid. Gets to be 16, everybody loves him. He helps people, he's very caring and loving. All the people in the community love him, but he goes to prison for this stupid crime. Then in prison, he gets attracted to the gang people because that's his safest option that he can figure out. He's in there all by himself. He has no one to consult about this. The only people who talk to are in the gangs themselves. So he makes this very bad move, but when he made the bad move, then I start talking about gender issues. I talk about male development. I talk about the dominance hierarchy, toxic masculinity, that kind of thing. I explain all that to the jury. We're in front of a jury, and they're going to decide on the sentence. Now, once he moves over, and this is what I mean is the top and the bottom are very starkly defined, and you're either or. Once he moves over towards the gangs, he has to follow the rules. One of the strongest rules that we on the outside don't really know is that when something's going down, we all know that you're supposed to not see anything and not say anything. So there was a picture on television of a New York, one of the big prisons, Attica or somewhere, where there's this big hallway where just hundreds of people are passing by. It looks like Broadway at early evening. And someone kills someone. Everybody keeps right on walking, and then they empty the place, and there's this dead body on the ground. Nobody saw anything, and that's prison. So one of the rules that we don't know, so we know that rule, you don't see anything and you don't say anything or you get killed. That's a rule in prison. Another rule is if your brother is in trouble, you stand by him. And at Dennis's level of affiliation with these people, if you don't, we will kill you. And that was explained to me by a bunch of prisoners. It's an unwritten rule. Only the prisoners know about this. We don't get that deep into understanding prisons out here, so just know that. But his choices when his cellmate, and he didn't know his cellmate was going to kill someone. He thought he was going to maybe beat him up or something to collect a debt. But actually he was killing him in order to gain entry into the gang. If he'd have left, he honestly believed he'd be killed. So I told the jury that. We won. What does win mean? The choices were life without parole or the death penalty. This is a death penalty trial. And we won life without parole, which, what kind of victory is that? But at least we didn't have the death penalty. Now, I'm claiming, and I think this is the only controversial thing, that the model that I just presented with the 4 points for male, the dominance hierarchy or toxic masculinity in prison, is actually the model in the women's prison, is actually the experience of homophobia, and is actually what happens to transgender people in prison. The male dominance hierarchy is hegemonic, and it's hegemonic across the sexes and gender variables and such. So the male dominance hierarchy explains misogyny. It's very misogynistic. They're labeling the bottom in the feminine. It explains homophobia. Anybody who has anything approximating female characteristics is going to be beaten and raped. It explains hate crimes against trans people. One of the things about the kind of dominance hierarchy I'm describing is there's no ambiguity. You can't challenge gender norms. You're either a top dog or bottom of the heap. And if there's anything about you that can be interpreted as feminine to any degree, you're at the bottom. And there's no, explaining, well, I'm different. So let me take each of these categories. I'll start with women. I already gave you the example. Sexual abuse is very pervasive in prison. A lot of it doesn't reach the courts. It's sexual harassment, but it takes, for instance, this form. When women prisoners leave the cafeteria, a certain number of them are searched. They can't search all of them. They don't have enough officers, but they search a certain number. They're searching them to see if they're taking fruit out of the cafeteria to take to their cell so that they can make homemade wine, which is called pruno. You take the fruit and you distill it, and then you've got some kind of alcoholic beverage. Good-looking women prisoners tell me, I get searched several times each time I leave the cafeteria. And women who are not quite as good-looking tell me I never get searched. So you've got these officers, they've got a quota. They have to search a certain amount of people. What do? They choose someone who they're attracted to or who's good-looking, then they fondle them. There are rules in prison about how you do pat searches, and there's actually court cases where we've won that there can be no transgender pat searches, but they happen anyway. And one thing is, you do not put your hands on a woman's breast. You can run your hands under, and you can, do various things that'll tell you if she's got a gun, but you don't just feel her breasts, and you don't put your hand in her crotch. And they have various ways to say this, but what the women tell me is they put their hands in my crotch, and they feel me up good, and they, rub my breasts, and they do this, and they do that. This is daily. Nobody complains about this, such that there's a lawsuit, but it's daily. Now, when a woman is raped, like the woman that I described to you earlier, then we start saying to her, so what was it like leaving the cafeteria? They were always groping me. And what do they call you? They call me girl. They call all the women girl. So there's this culture of misogyny where they're calling all of the women, some of these women are 60, 70 years old, and they're calling them girls. They're slapping them on the butt. They're groping them when they leave the cafeteria. This is misogyny. And it's only in that kind of misogynistic culture that rape can happen. And rape happens quite a lot. My 4-point model applies to that. There's the dominants, who have the power to do whatever they want to you, and there are people at the bottom of the hierarchy. Women are at the bottom of the prisoners. Women prisoners are at the bottom of the hierarchy. Now, again, this is a mirror of our gender relations out here, right? Why is it that all these women are saying me too, including famous movie stars and senators and assembly people? And I don't hear any men saying that they've been sexually harassed. What is that about our gender relation? It's the same thing as going on in prison. It's just that out here in the corporate boardroom, we don't search the women when they leave the cafeteria. We do other things, and that's coming out more and more. So that's the story with women. The starkness of the dominance hierarchy limits possibilities for people at every point in the hierarchy. That is, for men, there is a limitation of personal qualities like empathy, like being open about how we're feeling, etc. If you're going to be a dominating boss who sexually harasses your underlings, you're not exactly going to be open and feeling and caring. And, so it limits possibilities. Transgender. The problem, a lot of transgender people go to prison. And they go to prison for various reasons. One of the places they go to prison is immigration. We have a lot of transgender people seeking to come into the United States because of a feeling that they have more opportunities here. They get caught. Now, transgender women, that means people who have a male body anatomically who identify as female, often will get surgery. They may or may not get surgery. If they're going to get surgery, they might get arrested before they've had the surgery. Now, if they come to prison and they're absolutely a woman, you meet these people, you don't know that they're trans. They are a woman. They're coming, but they have a penis. They're going to get sent to a male prison. Now, just think about all that I've just described that's happening in the male prison. They're going to get raped. And so I've done several cases where they got raped. One of them, it was at Folsom Prison, and it's a particularly tough prison in California, and they have double celling because they don't have enough room for all the prisoners. And so this trans woman gets sent to Folsom and has to double cell with someone. So a tough guy sweet talks her and says, come sell with me, you know, we have a lot in common, and he pretends to be intellectual, and she's intellectual. As soon as the cell door closes, he starts grabbing her and harassing her and raping her. And she says to the guard, you know, get me out of here, this guy is abusing me. The guard says, what's the matter, you like dick? And we went to court about that. So the 4 points that I mentioned apply here. Now I want to switch for a minute, and then I'm going to stop and open up the floor, but to solitary confinement. I'm here to tout a book that I wrote on solitary confinement. What does solitary confinement have to do with all this? Well, I've been testifying. Solitary confinement is a problem in our prisons, also not that well known, although there's a 60-minute show with Oprah the other night about it. But it's given very little attention. But basically, we have more prisoners per capita in the United States by far than any other country in the world. So far above any European country or Japan that is ridiculous. Our closest competitor is Rwanda. And if we take the United States incarceration numbers as 100%, Rwanda's at 70, China and Russia are at 50, and the European countries are down in the 10 or 20. So we imprison more people than any other country. We use solitary confinement by far more than any other country. We have 100,000 people in solitary confinement. I think that's a very conservative estimate. And there are all kinds of solitary confinement. Some of them aren't technically, just like I said, the prisoner who agrees to be a sexual partner of a tougher prisoner is not considered sexually abused. That's a voluntary relationship, right? No coercion involved, no limited possibilities. Well, the same is true of solitary confinement. Our jails are mainly solitary confinement. There are dorms, but there are also single cells, and the prisoners in jail in a single cell stay there all the time. They don't come out. Solitary confinement. People can spend years there waiting for trial. And one of the things I speak about when I'm talking about that other subject, which is solitary confinement, is it drives people crazy. And it drives everybody crazy. But people with mental illness, it exacerbates the mental illness, and so that becomes the most obvious case. I was in a trial in California called Ashker v. Brown. And Ashker is a prisoner who's been in solitary confinement. He was at Pelican Bay State Prison. He's been at one prison or another in solitary for close to 40 years. And they were never planning to let him out. We won this lawsuit. We settled it such that they have to let him out. But I was asked to go in and talk to the prisoners. I had done other trials in other states or in California where people had been in solitary for a year or two. And I'd met people who had been in solitary for 30 years, but we never had a trial about them. The Ashker case was about them. And the question I was asked is, what can I say about what happens to people who are in solitary for more than a few years? And the class we represented were in for 10 years. People in 10 years or more, so Ashker qualified, although he was close to 40 years. What's different? And I found two things. One is that people in solitary for decades start isolating themselves even within the confines of solitary. So prisoners in solitary, they can't talk to anybody. They got a door facing usually out on a hallway. Usually there's no windows at Pelican Bay. There's no windows anywhere. There's no windows in the cell, and there's no windows in the hallway. But they can yell. And they know who's in the neighboring cells, and they can yell, "Hey, Joe, how's it going?" And they do. And they have conversations. They pass trains. They throw a string out, and they send a message to someone a few cells down. As they spend decades in solitary, they stop doing that. And I said, well, why do you do that? And they said, look, I get up in the morning. I used to say, hey, Joe, how's it going? But I got tired of it because every day's the same. Joe's not going to have anything to say, so I just stopped trying. And the officer brings their food tray and shoves it through the slot in the door. The officer's not interested in talking. And it used to be that they say to the officer, what's happening out there in the news? What's going on in the world? And the officer may or may not respond. They stop asking. And that's what I mean. They isolate themselves even within the constraints of the solitary situation. So they become very isolated, and when they get out of prison, they continue by habit to isolate themselves more than the situation requires. The other thing is they become numb to their feelings. And the way I've put this together from interviewing these prisoners, they're the ones that teach me this, anger is one of the symptoms that universally occurs in solitary confinement. And the way prisoners tell it, I'm mad about being in here. I'm mad at the guards for disrespecting me. But my anger is growing disproportionate to that being mad. I am getting so angry, I don't understand it. It's irrational. It's not a reaction to a particular guard doing a particular, it just keeps growing. And I'm scared to death that my anger is going to make me do something that'll get me in more trouble. For instance, get me more time in solitary. So I sit on it. Now, as they sit on their anger, and this is the way psychology works, they're also suppressing all of the rest of their feelings, because feelings tend to connect with each other, and you tend to be more or less expressive of your feelings. If you start suppressing your anger, gradually you're suppressing everything else, and you start getting out of touch with your feelings. The result, well, that's my theory, by the way. The result is, what they tell me is, I don't feel anything. I feel numb. I feel dead. I feel like a zombie. And that's what's different from people who have been in solitary for a short time. The people who have been in for a long time are extra isolative and extra closed off to their feelings. Now let's go back out into the community at large. How does that do for men who, as a gender phenomena, have problems expressing themselves and having friends, right? Being intimate. People who have been in solitary, I call this the decimation of life skills, which in my writing I call that torture. That is, we have taken from them the very capabilities that make social life among human beings possible. And knowing what you're feeling and being able to express it, and wishing to relate to other people and having some skills in doing that are part of life skills. We take them away by putting them in solitary confinement. So it multiplies just exactly what we're discussing out here as hegemonic masculinity or toxic masculinity. Let me go through what happens in solitary for the groups that I've talked about. Men. Very tough guys get thrown in solitary for fighting. They might fight an officer, they might, try to escape, they might do something wrong. They get thrown in solitary. If they're gang affiliated, they get thrown in solitary. Now, you've got these very tough guys who are confined. The head of the Colorado Department of Corrections just wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in which he said, you spend years in a cell the size of a parking space. That's what a solitary cell is. Your bathroom's in there, your food is passed in there. You put this very tough guy who has managed to survive out there on the yard in this very closed space. He starts getting angry, starts crying, starts getting paranoid, has trouble concentrating and trouble with memories, despairs of ever getting out, thinks about suicide. Now, all of this is not consistent with his gender identity. That is, he has adopted a role of being a tough guy out there on the yard. And people tell me, I can handle, this is an extremely violent, non-friendly environment, and I've learned to survive in it. But I can't survive in a solitary cell. And they have enormous psychological symptoms, and they fall apart. That's typical, and that's what I testify about with stable people, not people with mental illness. Then if they have a mental illness, and a lot of people have mental illness and don't even know it when they go to prison, they're bipolar or schizophrenic or something, and it emerges in solitary confinement. Women. First of all, women have an extra problem, which is gender-related in solitary. And that is, I think, on average, and we can debate this, women have more quality, intimate circles than men. Whether we call it friends, whether we call it the capacity to empathize, mother, whatever. To women, social connection is just a little more important than it is to men. And when they're in solitary, they universally say, I can't stand it, not having connection with anybody. So it's a particular kind of torture for women. Not that men aren't also tortured by it, but the torture has to do with what we think about in gender studies as differences between men and women. But how is solitary used in women's facilities? Solitary is something that was invented for very tough guys who the staff were afraid that they can't control physically, so they stick them in a solitary cell. Staff's not worried about controlling women physically. One guard can take down a woman, usually. There are some women that I wouldn't want to tangle with, but the security and the discipline setup is established for men, but then it's applied to women, and it's excessive force right from the beginning. So they shackle women. Women are much less likely to fight, much less likely to escape, and much easier to manage in a prison. But they use the male rules, and they'll shackle them, they'll put chains around their waist and their feet and everything. So they'll put them in solitary for crimes, rule violations that really don't warrant punishment at all, but certainly don't warrant solitary confinement. Then the woman is going to have a lot of problems having no social connection. All right, sexual abuse is massively underreported. The business about the searches leaving the cafeteria, we're not even touching that. It's so mild compared to the other stuff that happens. I'm talking about rape and just overt, awful abuse. Women don't report it. Why don't they report it? They're in a prison where the guards have a sworn but unspoken vow not to report what each other does. They're going to be spending years in that facility with these guards. If they report a guard for raping them, all the other guards are going to harass them. Now, how are they going to retaliate? How are they going to retaliate? One thing they can do is write them a bogus ticket, which is a disciplinary report, say for anything, for being out of place or possessing something that's contraband. The woman doesn't get visits with her children. That's a very, very important consideration. So women are going to tend to do whatever they have to do not to get that disciplinary report so they can see their children. All right, they report sexual abuse, which can be clear rape, and nobody saw it. There's nobody to back them up. It's going to be their word against his. It's going to get basically disappeared. They're going to, see a hearing officer who's going to ask them what happened. They'll say what happened. They're going to call the officer in what happened and say what happened. Hearing officer says, well, it's his word against hers. There's nothing I can do about this. We're done. But in the meantime, the woman has been in solitary confinement while the investigation went on. In other words, for reporting a rape, you get solitary confinement for your own good. So I am often asked, because there's a wonderful feminist legal team in Michigan who has uncovered all of this, and I testify for them. And what they do is they go in and talk to women, and they make connections, and they develop trusting relationships and get the women to talk. And then the woman says, I was raped by this officer over here. And they said, would you be willing to tell that to the court? And they said, I don't know, it terrifies me to do something about it. Have you reported it? No. Why didn't you report it? Because I was afraid either of solitary confinement or retaliation by all the other officers, including women officers, by the way. For reporting an officer, you get retaliated on pretty badly. And this woman is going to be serving years in prison. So what they do, this legal team, is they go into the prison and they talk to these women over and over again. It takes years. And then they go to trial. They've got a collection of women. They had 500 in the state of Michigan. And this is from a huge team of feminist attorneys going in talking to lots of women saying, would you be willing to be a plaintiff in this lawsuit? They eventually go to court, and then I'm asked to come in and explain. The Attorney General says, look, they couldn't have been raped. They didn't report it. It took them 6 months to report it. The lead lawyer, puts me on the stand and says, Dr. Kupers, is there any reason why a woman who had been raped would be hesitant to report it? And then I tell them all that I've just told you. And so those are the cases. So now, again, that's exactly where we are in our culture wars out here, with this whole Me Too phenomena. But you see how solitary works. Youth tend to be put in solitary, and I'll tell you how it happens. Like my client, Dennis Levis, they're scared about the yard, and they're afraid of being raped or beaten or whatever. And what they do is they say, solitary looks like a solution to my problem. So they go and they hit another prisoner, or they hit a guard. And then they get put in solitary. But what they didn't realize was that in solitary, they're going to go crazy. And so all kinds of awful things happen. It happens to be worse among teenagers to be put in solitary for a number of reasons. Partly their energy level, partly their inexperience and immaturity. But solitary actually causes more damage to youth. So I go in and I find them in solitary and I say, what are you doing here? And they say, I hit someone. Well, why'd you hit someone? I was scared and I didn't think I could handle the yard, so I hit someone to get into solitary. But solitary is hell. The trans person, one of the things, the staff don't know what to do with trans people. They don't understand it. They never seen anything like this in their life. They strip them down and this woman has a penis. And the guard is standing there, what's going on here? And so they don't know what to do with them. They don't know how to talk to them. They talk with great disrespect. They rape them a lot. So they don't know what to do with them. What do? They put them in solitary. Now, if the trans woman is sexually assaulted, she's going to be put in solitary for the same reason women are put in solitary in general, and that is for their own protection. So solitary figures largely in all of these gender issues. Let me just, I think I should probably finish up.
Yeah.
When I speak about solitary confinement, I don't want to leave you all with this dark sense. So let me talk for a minute about rehabilitation. I, in my book, spend half the time talking about solitary confinement and half about rehabilitation. What's the alternative to solitary is what I'm always asked. We're locking these people up because they're out of control. First of all, they're not out of control. They lock up a lot of people who are not. They're not the worst of the worst. They throw in a whole lot of people and keep them there too long. But the alternative is to downsize the prisons. That involves sentencing reform. That involves, for instance, diversion, where we send people to treatment programs in the community, recovery programs, so they don't have to be in prison. So massively reducing the size of the prisons, reversing the imprisonment binge, and then doing rehabilitation. And I have a list of things that we need to do in the prison, staff, all staff, officers, mental health staff, medical staff, teachers. First, we have to break the cycle of violence. We have to stop hurting people because they broke a rule, which makes them want to hurt someone in return. We have to treat people with respect. Mutual respect is what I call it. The officers have to treat the prisoners as if they were human beings, which, as strange as it might seem, they don't do. They have to increase the agency of the prisoner. One of the biggest problems for prisoners getting out of prison, particularly women, is subservience, excessive compliance, which they were programmed to do in prison because the prison staff won't tolerate any opposition. You cannot have an idea of your own. You have to do what the rules require you to do. People come out of prison and they lack initiative. They lack any kind of creativity about, reconstructing their life. And that is a huge problem. That's probably the bigger mental health problem than actually the psychotic breakdowns and suicide. Then you have to keep the person in touch with the outside world while they're in prison. both loved ones, they have to have quality contact, and that's really a problem in the prisons, which tend to be far away, and the rules for visiting tend to be very harsh, but also about what's going on in the world. Prisoners should be informed what's going on in the world, they should be given education, etc. And finally, you have to help them think about the future and a better future for themselves. When the officers are yelling at them, sexually assaulting them, and calling them, you know, total nothing and a piece of shit, they don't think about, let's see, if I wasn't in prison, I think I'd finish college and maybe get myself a job, and maybe I should be working on some skills and reading certain books now so that I'll be ready when I get out of prison. And the staff should be facilitating that process and saying, well, who are you and who are you going to become? Let's see if you can do some work to get there better once you get out of here. That would be a rehabilitative attitude. It's happening. There are people in the prisons who are doing that. We're winning struggles. You've had a struggle in New York to end solitary confinement. The New York Civil Liberties Union just won a lawsuit barring juveniles from solitary confinement at Rikers Island. Now, they're barring the juveniles from solitary confinement. Some of these juveniles are hard to manage. I mean, they come in with a lot of energy and they're pretty oppositional. What are they doing with these juveniles at Rikers Island so that they can keep them out of solitary? Whatever they're doing, they happen to be doing some good things, I know. Whatever they're doing with the juveniles, why can't they do that with the adults? What do you need solitary confinement for? And Colorado has ended solitary confinement. So when I get told by correction officials, well, we need it to manage unmanageable people. And if we didn't have it, the prison system would just be a total mess. I'll mention to them, well, Colorado doesn't have it, and I don't see them becoming a mess. So there are remedies. I don't want to leave you with too dark of an impression, but I wanted to get into the gender dynamics so that we can have a discussion about it, so I had to tell you about some of the ugly things like rape and such. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. So I think you're perfectly capable of handling questions on your own. You don't need me as a mediator. So please, the floor is open. Ask Terry any kinds of questions you want.
And it doesn't have to be a question if you have comments too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Terry. Thanks for the very inspiring presentation. And I think I'll put my comments and questions in context. Like in our brief chat, yes, I'm from South Africa. And then in 2004, I trained as a psychologist, and I worked at Johannesburg prison. It's called like Sun City, and also Portsmouth, the prison that you visited. And obviously, I guess a lot of similarities. I mean, in terms of I guess where you started in terms of your presentation, the conditions, and lock them away, throw the key, and not knowing that in no time some of these guys will be coming out of prison. And also, I guess the issue of violence in the prison. But the few questions that I want to ask, I mean, in terms of the model that you proposed, I mean, to say, when I look at the model, I mean, in terms of male prisoners, it does explain, I guess, the process very well, especially, the top and the bottom. But with female prisoners, I would want to hear more, in terms of how does that dynamic play itself out, especially because all the work that is being done in terms of gangs in prison, it's more with males, but less with women. And I'm not sure in terms of your work, have you done a lot of interviews in terms of the gang dynamics amongst female prisoners? And then maybe I'll ask two questions and then give others an opportunity. What does it mean to be a guard? To be like a president, like an official, because there is like something like around where like I don't know. I mean, in terms of even differences between male and female like guards, because there are instances, especially in South Africa, there's a recent case now where female guards were found like guilty for sleeping with male like prisoners, and which is like something very like rare. But what emerged out of that like case is that it is something very like common. And for some male prisoners, they were like arguing to say they did not like fully consent, for them to have sex with like female like prison like officials. And then the last question, I mean, which maybe I'll talk to you after this. I've also been called, I mean, in few like cases to be an expert like witness, and I'm not sure if in the US all prisons are public owned, or are they those that are privately run? Because in South Africa, we have a case now with the G4. I think it's a British like company, which then got contracted in South Africa. I mean, to run 2 prisons like privately. So what will happen? Obviously, I mean, they'll be torturing like a lot of like prisoners, including solitary like confinement. And now there's a case with this like company, and in fact they'll even inject them with all kinds of like substances, to a point where they. But where we are at now with the case, we do not know the substance that they were like using, but apparently it will make prisoners to be a bit robotic. They will become psychotic. They will not able to move, and they will present with all kinds of like mental health like problems. So obviously, I guess like my question there, it's more like around are the differences in terms of prisons that are public owned as compared to those that are privately like owned. And then I'm interested lastly in terms of solitary like confinement, and especially around where, because when you look at it, the body, I mean they use the body. This is your own body, but your own body tends like against you. Because you get to a point where this body that you trusted, being muscular, being strong, being tough, it becomes weak. It can no longer do things that it used to do in tolerating very harsh conditions. And they at the psychological level, it's where you talk about, I guess, the intensity of solitary confinement. Because said that during your confinement, you're no longer being beaten up, but it's your body that tends against you. So obviously from a psychiatric point of view, I'm interested in terms of the recovery process, where you're talking about where you begin to dissociate, you begin to leave the body. Dissociation will explain it better. Thanks. Sorry for being taken.
So big canvas. Do you want to answer this? You want to just take some more?
Now let
comments?
you've asked a bunch of, or commented on a bunch of things, so let me just say a few things.
Sure.
First of all, the thing you said last is brilliant, and is absolutely true, and I think we need to look at it more. That is, contrast this tough guy who is successful out on the yard, being muscular, looking tough, having a stare like he could kill somebody, and not depending on anybody, taking care of his business by himself, all the things exaggerated that are hegemonic masculinity. Put him in a solitary cell, and his body is going to fail him. He's going to find himself crying. He's going to find himself anxious. He's going to find himself cognitively impaired so that he can't figure things out by himself. And you're right, it creates a dilemma for him. And I think that drives a lot of people to suicide. It's certainly something he wasn't prepared for. He got prepared to fight for his honor out on the yard. Now we're sticking him in solitary. He's got nobody to respect him for his toughness. And instead he's becoming all of the things he was learning to despise. It's a huge contradiction and creates a problem for him. In terms of staff, I've been accused of being anti-staff. I have a lot of ideas about staff because when I testify at trial, for instance, sexual abuse at trial, the judge is going to ask me, so what do you think should be done? One of the things that's just absolutely unacceptable is that staff who sexually violate women prisoners are fired. They go to another state and get a job in a corrections department. How can that be? So when we find guards that are doing this, and this legal team in Michigan, by the way, takes the file, local district attorneys cannot prosecute prison guards because they don't have enough staff and they can't do the research, right? So they take their file, which they accumulated from the civil litigation, and they give it to the DA in the local county. The DA prosecutes the guard for sexual abuse, rape, violence, whatever. And some of those guards are prosecuted and convicted. But a lot go to other states. In the process, we find out that this guard who has raped women in Michigan was previously employed as a correction officer in Idaho, Montana, and somewhere else, and was fired in all of those places for sexually abusing women prisoners. How could that happen? So a very simple thing is to run a check when someone applies to be a prison guard. Have they been convicted of domestic violence? Do they have a drinking problem? How do they treat women? And do a more thorough, recruitment and search for what's going on, what kind of person is this? Training? How about doing some gender, race, and other sensitivities so they don't wind up guarding people like trans women who they know nothing about? And so we could do a lot better with that. And then supervision, where there's zero tolerance. Zero tolerance requires breaking the blue code. That is, if a warden or a commissioner is going to have zero tolerance, for instance, for sexual abuse, they have to require that staff inform on each other when a rule is being violated. I think that's what we should have done with Harvey Weinstein 30 years ago. People need to inform when something like that is happening. So we've got that problem out here, sexual harassment. I mean, did people really not know that O'Reilly was abusing all the women at Fox? They had to know it and turn their eyes away. So we need to encourage not so much tattletaling, but informing when something awful is going on so that it can be corrected. They don't have guards in Scandinavia. In Scandinavian countries, mostly, there's exceptions, mostly what they have is master's level staff. The master's degree is a combination of education, psychological counseling, and custody. So everybody is informed with the skills to first manage the prison and second, prepare the prisoners for success after the release. We don't have that.
What?
They have a lot less prisoners as well.
Yeah.
They're actually selling their prison spaces.
Well, they don't
There's
send people to
much
prison.
space for the amount of prisoners.
Right. They don't send people to prison for all the little things we send them to prison for. So they have a smaller number of prisoners, and they have institutions that are small. They have a whole lot of things better than.
But it's a completely different culture.
Yeah.
Absolutely different culture. You don't have the degree of this multiculturalism you have in this country. You don't have a class situation. You don't have the income disparity. You really don't have the income disparity. God.
So there are things we can do about staff, and we should be doing it. In the United States, prison officers tend to be very little educated. They tend to be, actually, California is an exception. They tend to be not well paid, not well trained, and not well supervised. And then these abuses occur. We could do a lot better. Yes?
You spoke a little bit about the context of male officers and assaults on female inmates. What about, although I'm sure it doesn't happen as often in terms of male officers on male inmates, my guess is that's even discussed less. What kind of knowledge do you have in that area?
Actually, it's a big problem, and it actually is the subject of lawsuits. And there is sexual abuse by male staff with male prisoners, male staff with female prisoners, and female staff with both male and female prisoners. So it all gets prosecuted when we hear about it. But I would say we've only got the tip of the iceberg, that it happens 1,000 times for every time we hear about it and we go to court over it. The women, it's a sad story and needs to be studied, but at Corcoran Prison a number of years ago, it was actually in the 90s, they had what were called gladiator fights. And this was, in California, the gangs are pretty tough, you know, and they're running drugs. And the Crips, in prison, it's the Black Guerrilla Family, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia. And they have very strong antagonisms across racial lines. So if a tough guy from the Mexican Mafia gets together with a tough guy from the Aryan Brotherhood, they're probably going to fight. So solitary confinement is about separating people so they don't fight. Well, the guards would purposely put a prisoner from the Aryan Brotherhood together with a prisoner from the Mexican Mafia and then watch them fight and bet on their fighting. And this was discovered because 7 people were killed in this way, because then the officers would eventually stop the fight by shooting somebody from the tower up above. So one of the things we found out when it got reported, it got reported because some officers were whistleblowers, and they came and they told somebody, I think it was the Attorney General or someone, they told them about this. And what we discovered is that when they were betting on the guys on the yard fighting, they would ask the women officers from far away in the prison to come over and watch with them. It was like watching a football game or something. They would take bets, and then they would say to the woman guard, "We're going to shoot that guy. Do you want to do it?" And a lot of times the trigger was pulled by a woman guard. So I haven't studied this further. I think there's a lot of wannabe kind of behavior on the part of women officers in that situation, and the woman wants to be respected by her male tough guy guard counterparts, and so terrible things happen. The women do not report the sexual abuse that the male guards do. In an exception, a woman was a whistleblower in Michigan, a woman guard, and soon after she told the lawyers about what was going on, she was attacked and knifed badly in the parking lot by someone wearing the kind of black boots that guards wear. Yes?
I have a couple of comments and then a sort of a general question. First, I hope that my colleagues from Stony Brook can see why I think that your work is so heroic. I mean, to be able to use your expertise to really do good in the world just strikes me as so inspiring. So it's something that I've always loved about you, and hearing you talk about it just reinforces that. Second thing, for those of you who don't know this, I just want you to know where, that, as you said, you want to know something about a society, look at its prisons. That was what Dostoevsky said. You may know that when Tocqueville wrote the greatest book ever written about American society, Democracy in America, he came here initially in 1836 to study American prisons. And the reason was because American prisons had invented this new reform organized and initiated by the Quakers who ran our prison system. The idea was solitary confinement, because this was an idea for the person who had committed a crime to sit with himself, to get it back in touch with his inner light and begin the process of self-reformation. So solitary confinement was originally an enlightened, Quaker-inspired idea. It was inspired by an idea, and this is where this is now leading to my question. It was inspired by an idea that you go to prison, that going to prison is the punishment, that you are separated from society, where you begin your rehabilitation to re-enter society. We now have a system in which you go to prison in order to be punished, right? So prison is simply the location where more punishment will be visited upon you. So here's what I hear from you. I hear that we have a bunch of structural and historical problems that are relatively new in the United States that have increased our prison populations, like mandatory drug sentencing, 3 strikes, you're out. Also, the Reagan era deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill. There's no more community mental health centers because we just send people to prison because we deinstitutionalize them. Felon disenfranchisement, which means that when you go to prison, you give up your citizenship, you give up your rights. The privatization of our prison system, where prisons are now run for profit, so the food is worse, there's no library facilities because that all costs money, and the goal of the prison is profit. And trying juveniles as adults, as you say. So these are all specific historical and kind of structural phenomena that create this kind of, the conditions for a truly horrific system, which is what we have. And then underneath that you have, and this is where I see the real sharpness of your analysis. So underneath that you have a system that is organized for the dehumanization. That's the goal. Because as long as you're dehumanized, order is possible, social control is possible. So you want the gangs to fight. You want them. You want to create these kinds of this kind of disorder or this hierarchy of toughs and bitches in prison, precisely because it serves the social order of the prison. What you do is you create an intermediate variable, which is the constellation of meanings of gender, right? So you say that dehumanization is a gendered phenomenon. It's experienced differently by women and men for different reasons. I think that's terrific, and I think that's the piece. That's a piece that has been missing. So rather than and I'm glad that you ended with the rehabilitation part. So here come my questions, because I don't know where we enter. I mean, as a scholar, as a citizen, I keep thinking like, should we be working on felon disenfranchisement? I mean, that's clearly a violation of the Constitution. Should we be working on, against privatization? Should we, you're suggesting, solitary confinement. Let's go after that. Another thought I had while you were talking is maybe what we need is more surveillance in prison. Maybe what we need is cameras everywhere so that these rapes by staff are seen and you sort of short circuit the staff reporting on each other problem. Like some, feed and like the military, it needs to be fed outside the chain of command, outside the prison, outside the warden, to civilian review boards that are able to get access to these kinds of videotapes that are ongoing, constant in every corner of the prison, right? So there's no place you can go where you're not being seen, right? Maybe that's a solution, more surveillance, not less. I mean, I don't know, but my feeling is how do we engage with this question given the massive structural and historical specificity of the situation? And I also say, as I heard others say, I don't know about you, but I have been in Swedish prisons, visiting the most feared neo-Nazis who are serving what are called life sentences in Sweden, which is 14 years. And they, if you ever have to go to prison, go to Sweden. The food was good. It was like going to the prison cells were kind of like a little bit smaller than Holiday Inn rooms.
Motel 6.
You got it. Thank you. Yeah, Motel 6. Spare, furnished, because their idea is you're here. This is your punishment. So now we have to help you get better. You're not here to get punished. It was quite amazing, and I remember calling Amy from my first visit and saying, if I ever have to go to a maximum security prison, could you make sure I go to Sweden? Anyway, that just some random comments.
First of all, I want to make a recommendation. It's absolutely true. Solitary confinement, Benjamin Franklin was an advocate.
Yeah.
And for penance, and that is you should spend time alone in a cell, which I think is the thought in Scandinavia today. And think about your crimes and the way your life is going wrong. It very quickly turned into warehousing because of the Walnut Street jail where he did that, and then Eastern prison in Pennsylvania became overcrowded. So they started putting 2 and 3 people in that cell that where you're supposed to be doing your penance in, and those people started fighting, and the guards started beating people up. So it just turned into warehousing at Eastern Pennsylvania, at Auburn here in New York. Oscar Wilde was in the Reading jail and wrote a long ballad of the Reading jail.
Yeah.
That's Eastern Pennsylvania. The Reading jail was set up on Benjamin Franklin's model. It's called the Pennsylvania model. And it was supposedly about solitary confinement. And then Oscar Wilde writes this unbelievably graphic poem. It's a ballad poem about the horrors of solitary confinement.
Interesting.
I happen to be at the Center for the Study of Men and Masculinity, talking to Michael Kimmel, among others, so I'm going to say something about theory. I don't think I don't think gender is primary. I think domination is primary.
Mm-hmm.
That is, I think there's something about the laws of capitalism which makes domination the order of the day. And then in any social setting, the lines of domination will be created. Well, in the general experience in the world, gender is a major line that allows for domination. So is race, so is class. And I don't want to prioritize one or another. I really think domination is priority,
So
is
do you
the
think the
primary.
patriarchy goes with that?
I'm sorry?
Would you say that the domination runs along the lines of patriarchy?
Yes. And patriarchy is a system of domination.
I mean,
But
I'm really glad you're bringing this up, because one thing I thought about your talk is I thought, well, now where's the political analysis in this talk? So now you're bringing that to us.
yes.
I mean, one of my thoughts was, did this hypervigilance in the prison system that we have now, where we have these outrageous situations of solitary confinement, of severe punishment, of horrible psychological punishment, of physical punishment, of violence, all this stuff, has that come about because we've gone through a major change in society where public morality has been maybe ripped apart?
Yes.
So this is the flip side, the correction to this ripping apart of what is the public morality. And at another point earlier, let's say when we had a lost hegemony in America, which believed in very much in the virtues of virtue, that society was supposed to go on an even but possibly mediocre level, that the prisons were not quite like that. They were not like that.
Right. And they
So I
don't.
wonder about that.
And they don't need to be, as the Scandinavian
Yeah,
prisons prove. You know, there's all levels to this discussion. What I'm really advocating is that we look at all the levels at once. On a large social level, what we're dealing with is the contradictions of capitalism. I think we're in a very dark period. Capitalism is about class domination. That's always been under capitalism. I don't think it's going to stop soon. However, there are periods of greater and lesser contradiction. We have a gap between the rich and the poor right now that is greater than ever. Maybe it matches what Dickens was writing about in 2 centuries ago. So something has happened with history. It's still class domination. But at one point in the class domination, for instance in the 60s, playing off of the gains from World War II and the relative affluence of the United States, we were able to give some wraparound services to the most disadvantaged people among us. Today we're not willing to do that as a society, and the concentration of wealth at the very top is unprecedented. Right? Those are historical developments. Now, with that historical development, it's not an accident that we have an unprecedented, massive incarceration. Because when you give everything to the very top, to the 1%, you've got a whole lot of unhappy people you have to control. You control them in various ways, but one way is the criminal justice system. So, you know, the whole thing works at all of these levels. Now, when I go in and look at a Dennis Levis, who's standing trial for murder and has the death penalty on top of him, I have to consider all of those things. I have to talk to the jury about all those things. I'm not suggesting that we overthrow capitalism. I don't think the jury would look at me favorably if I took that position. However, it's in the back of my mind. You know, the gap between rich and poor has something to do with what happened to this working class guy who grew up very poor without any parental supervision. We should analyze all of that. If there had been proper social services, he would have had some support growing up. The public schools would have picked it up. They would have said, Dennis, you're coming to school in dirty clothes. What's going on? And they didn't. And they didn't because we're defunding the public schools as part of the gap between the rich and the poor. We're not providing the social services that should have been looking out for him, not when he was 16 and doing this stupid crime, but when he was 8 and 9 and 10. So it's all connected, and what I'm advocating is keeping an eye on all of it. But I think it doesn't help to prioritize, for instance, gender over race. I think they're both lines that are constructed for domination to happen across, and it happens that they all play out together, that there's an interconnection between all of them. Yes?
I saw a video like the last couple of days, and I don't have the exact resource, I didn't save it, but it was about a prison on, like the island was a prison was a town, and the prisoners were allowed to leave and go to the town for a couple hours a day to shop and work, and then they'd have to return. And there's a tourist island, so I mean, these criminals are walking around with regular people who aren't prisoners, and it works out, and it's, I found that really amazing, because it's so opposite of what we do here. And like you talked about our out of sight, out of mind kind of culture with prisoners, do you think it would be more beneficial to the prisoners and society if we integrated the prisons more, maybe in smaller towns have it so that they could leave the prison and then return, something like that, even though we have this out of sight, out of mind culture? Like, would it possibly harm them more if they had to actually interact with society because of our opinion?
It's a very good point. What country was this? Do you know?
I think it was in the Netherlands area.
In where?
Up in the Netherlands, but I don't remember exactly what country.
Okay, because for instance, Mexico has, not Devil's Island, France has Devil's Island where they put very hardened criminals.
Used to, I mean, they've closed that now,
Yes,
right?
I think so. But Mexico has an island where they put people who have life in prison. They're not going to get out. They really mean life without parole. That person is not going to get out. In the United States, life without parole, 20 years later, your lawyer's going to argue, and I've helped people get parole who had life without parole. But in Mexico, they have a bunch of people who have life, period. They put them on an island, which is a city. It has a city on it, and their families can come live with them. And they have a society of prisoners. And it works very well. There's no violence.
Australia.
Everybody gets along. The two ideas that you discussed actually are doable. They're being done. I think either Connecticut or one of the states back here has it, where it's either work leave, and that is the prisoner is released from prison in the daytime to go hold a regular job, not a prison-related job, in the community, and then come back and sleep in the prison. Or the other way around. The prisoner is allowed to go home to spend the night with family. You know, what do we want to socialize people to do? The prisoner is released to go home and be with their kids in the evening, and then come back to prison to do their prison job. Both plans work. Nobody escapes from plans like that. Think about it. They're doing a long term in prison. You're giving them a partial prison as a step towards returning to the community. Why would they escape? You're going to catch them and stick them back in the hardcore prison. So people don't escape. They're not violent. This affects different parts of the population differently. When I give a talk in a large multicultural group, I will ask people who has a first-degree relative in prison, or who's been in prison, or something like that, knows somebody who's gone to prison, somebody from your high school class went to prison. All of the people of color in the room will raise their hands, and all of the white people will look around and be shocked. I don't know anybody who's gone to prison. And all the people of color will say, well, my uncle was in prison, my father was in prison. Now, they're human beings, the people in prison. They're part of our community. They're going to come back. 93% of prisoners are released. So we should keep them in our community and keep them in our hearts. And I think it's the racism of the criminal justice system that makes most white people ignorant about prison, because it doesn't affect us. And most people of color extremely knowledgeable about prison. And in those communities, it's no big stigma to have been in prison. You come out of prison and I'm glad to see you. Now you're going to take care of your children. This is great. It's not the same thing as happens in sort of the white mind about this, because it's such a strange experience for white people. Yes, we should integrate prisoners into our community. We should never alienate them from our community. They have to do a certain thing that we in society have, decided as punishment. It's a convention. Sending people to prison, you can punish people different ways. Sending them to prison is a convention of our criminal justice system. They're still people. By the way, there's a documentary, The 13th. Has anybody seen that?
Yeah.
Which talks about this.
Terry, 10% of German population is Turkish. 50% of the prison population in Germany is Turkish. So percentage is not unlike our own.
Similar.
But I don't hear any of this about prison conditions. I mean, the racism. And racism is pervasive in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
But what you described, the particular way in which this is a kind of dehumanization and emasculation of African American young males, that doesn't seem to be what happens in German prisons. So what makes us? What brings out and look, your boy Nevitt Sanford was part of the study that tried to say this was specific to the Holocaust was specific to Germany, right? Couldn't happen here. And of course they were quite wrong. What makes our society so much more willing to invoke that kind of dehumanizing cruelty? I don't even, similar percentages elsewhere, but the kind of cruelty that you see in our prisons does not obtain elsewhere. So what is it? I mean, is it the quality of our guards, as you say, they don't have master's degrees in, social work or whatever? Is it something else? Because there is a specificity. All these other countries are capitalist societies. There's class domination. There's racial domination. There's certainly gender hierarchies and patriarchy. Why do we stand out?
Well, it's an excellent question. If I had an answer, I'd write a book about that.
I wish you would.
The same question goes for gun violence. Why does the United States have so much gun violence and such a refusal to control guns? No other country has that. Compare us to Canada. Very comparable.
I think it's within the culture of the country. It's
Well,
simply within the
so-
culture of this country.
so
I
that
could
starts-
talk about the culture of the country next half an hour, but I don't think you want to hear it. But it's simply part of the culture of this country.
Well, then that's part of the answer to
The culture
Michael's
of the-
question.
yeah.
I went to Moscow to give a talk at a conference of people from mental hospitals and people who work in community mental health and people from the prisons. And I got there and they said to me, "Why do you put crazy people in prison?" And I said, "You don't?" And they said, "Absolutely not. If someone has a mental illness, they go to this other place where we torture them. But we don't put them in prison." Well, why do we happen to put crazy people? And we do. I believe that more than 50% of prisoners suffer from a serious mental illness. And why do we do that? I don't know the answer. There are historical turns. It's culture. It's about the Wild West. It's about the notion of independence and gunslinging and all this stuff.
And it's a
that set
political
of
will
beliefs,
to do anything.
it's fairly consistent what you said about Germany and Turkish people. In New Zealand, it's Maori.
Yeah.
Maori are less than 15% of the population. They're over 50% of the prisoners. And there just is a kind of social dynamic working. And yes, there are very specific things in the United States. Our sexism and homophobia is homegrown and unique. Now, there are similarities with sexism and homophobia in Europe. You see the anti-Semitism in Europe, and not in Germany. I mean, in France, in Portugal. there's something going on that we need to study, and it has historical specificities, and we need to study them. I feel very privileged, I happen to have access to American prisons. And the reason is, they like to keep researchers and visitors and press out so that we can't see what they're doing. But I happen to be testifying in court, and the judge can say, let them in. And so I get access. And with that access, I study what I study, which is just a little teeny part of the entire puzzle. So I've shared with you some of my ideas about the gender dynamics that I see in these places, and I see it because of that access. I feel very privileged to have that, also very compelled to come out and talk about it, because it's something that's nasty and we need to change it. So I don't have the whole picture. I theorize about the whole picture, like questions of domination and capitalism. I theorize about that. What I observe is aspects of masculinity which are unfortunate and which we've spent a lot of years trying to reverse.
That's a great note to end on, and we're at our time. So would you join me again in thanking Terry? I'm sure you can talk a little bit more informally, but thank you.
Thank
Really,
you. This has
great.
been a wonderful event for me, and I love the discussion.
And make sure, I think everybody signed in, but if you haven't, please do, and take some sweets with you on your way out. There's plenty of brownies and cookies for everyone.
I need my pen back.
I just want to say hello. I think you remember me. I'm Perry Brown.
Perry, hi.
For a minute, I thought, well, that couldn't be Michael Kimball, and there you are.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm okay.
Look
Good.
at the Hofstra students here.
Well, so I'm very glad that you came. That
Yeah.
was nice.
No,
nice to see you.
I really loved listening to you. I mean,
Perry's a poet.
well, I'm a writer.
Okay, sorry.
But I am also a poet. I am a writer. Yeah. Would it be possible for your press to send me a press copy of this book? Yeah. I mean, because I write. Yeah. Well, I write for a lot of books that go on post. And it's so fascinating when I said that when you were talking, I said, well, where's the political analysis here? And then you went into that. That's what's holding the whole damn thing together. That's the painful thing that people don't want to talk about.
Yes, that's true for some people, and I think for this group that's true. For some people, it will ruin my objectivity.
So,